We are rapidly coming towards the end of the course at this point, and in this lecture, I want to look at the topic of feminism, which, of course, is extremely broad and like all of the topics we've been looking at. And the textbook starts with this very strange story of the disco. I have no idea why he does that. And I find it interesting. He writes, the big question, do men oppress women? If so, what should we do about it? That was never the question of feminism. It was sort of a subset of the larger issue. So, in order to understand feminism, you have to understand it as a movement. And so there are important thinkers, but it was also a grassroots political movement with various players in it. And so I'll just give an example of what's generally called second wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s. A lot of what was moving it forward were what were called consciousness raising groups, where just groups of women would get together and just talk about their experiences or have sort of book club. So feminism is actually quite critical of just sort of picking on certain leaders and highlighting them. And in a way, that's part of the problem from the point of view of a lot of feminist thinkers. So it's really a much more decentralized grassroots movement, but I will be focusing on a number of important writers and thinkers. And so he begins with the three waves of feminism. This is one way of understanding it. In some ways, it does help organize a lot of material. And so, as he says on page 322, we can trace the beginnings of feminist theory back to the 1790s. So this takes us right back to the beginning of the course when I was laying out the foundations of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and the idea of the equality of human beings that comes out of that Enlightenment movement. And I did promise to get to this way back then, so that's what's happening now. So as he says, the French Revolution in particular, there were a lot of women that were participating in that larger movement. And so we see things like, as I said, the idea of inalienable rights. And so I already touched on this in terms of the American Constitution, that we know that the United States was a slaveholding society. So clearly they didn't really believe in practice in the equality of all human beings. So this has always been the tension. Once you unleash this idea of the equality of all human beings, logically, all these other groups are going to follow up on it. And so he notes that some of the women of the day took this talk of rights seriously and went a step further. Olympe de Georges wrote a pamphlet in 1791 called Declaration of the Rights of Woman and Citizen, in which she argued for equal legal and political rights for women. The declaration included a provision for marriage as a social contract between two equal parties that would end with a fair division of property. She was rewarded by the revolutionary government with a trip to the guillotine. So that's very chilling, and this is a very important point, that many of these liberatory movements, including Marxism, leave women out of the equation. So really it's the liberation of men, and often certain elite men is really what they're talking about when we really drill down into it. But nonetheless, the ideas start to go out there and they start to permeate, and people start to read and think about them. And so this goes on to seed not just feminism, all sorts of liberation movements. And so we're going to be turning to one of the most important thinkers in terms of this larger movement for women's rights, and that's Mary Wollstonecraft. I read a description of Mary Wollstonecraft's life years ago, and just to paraphrase it, it was something like her life was equal parts tragedy and genius, and that's absolutely true. She led a very tumultuous life, and as Man is saying, she was living in a very tumultuous time, and she threw herself into it, trying to create change. And so she was born into a family. She was the daughter of a farmer, and so she was not from a wealthy family and ended up working as a governess. And so this shapes her view of the world and sort of what are women's options outside of marriage, because she has to work herself. And she wrote a text called Thoughts on the Education of Daughters in 1787. So she's very concerned with women's education because she herself was a teacher. And I have read some of her diaries, and they're very funny. I believe she was in Ireland, and she was a governess for a very wealthy family. And all the girls she was supposed to be teaching, all they wanted to do was, do their hair and play with their dog. And she was very annoyed by this. And so she's writing to people about how annoyed she is by it. So in 1792, she left England to observe the French Revolution in Paris. And so she recognizes something radical and revolutionary is going on in Paris. And so she wants to participate and observe it and think about what that means for England. So England is watching all of this with a lot of dismay because they obviously don't want to lose the monarchy and lose their social system. So she goes there and she lives with an American captain, Gilbert Imlay. And in the spring of 1794, she gave birth to a daughter. So we can see already at this is the 18th century, she's having a child outside of marriage. And so the level of how controversial this is pretty difficult to even describe. And so we're told that she's so distraught when he leaves her that she attempts suicide, and it's a very famous story that she jumps off a bridge into the river, but she floats, and so somebody's able to rescue her. So a lot, as I said at the beginning, these very tragic elements within her story, and she was living herself the perils of being a woman in her society. And so when she returned to London, she began to work with various radical groups, including with Thomas Paine and with William Godwin, who was an anarchist. She eventually began a relationship with Godwin, and they married after she became pregnant. So her daughter, some of you may know, is Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, who herself had an incredibly turbulent life. There's actually a fairly recent movie made about Mary Shelley where they depict her writing in the graveyard, sitting with her back against her mother's gravestone and writing. And so Mary Wollstonecraft, I think in a final tragic irony, died as a result of childbirth. So she's kind of, as I said, living the challenges of being a woman in her time period. And she, as I said, leaves behind her daughter, Mary Shelley. Her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, is probably, in the English language, I would argue, single most important work that begins what we now call the feminist movement. In A Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft is jousting with Rousseau throughout the book, and he was one of the thinkers that led to the French Revolution. He was key to the French Revolution and the idea of the social contract. And so she's taking him on throughout the book. And I think this points to it's always been kind of perplexing fact throughout all of these waves of feminism that many of the most radical men of the time cannot see this as related to women. They only see it as related to men. So if they're talking about equal rights, they're really only talking about equal rights for men, and often for upper class men. So she's sort of jousting with him, and the idea that Rousseau's saying, women should just be attractive and so on. And so this tension has remained, and I'll just give a contemporary example of Bernie Sanders. Now, he's changed a lot. He's taken the critiques on board. But when he was first appearing on the kind of mainstream stage, he was quite tone deaf around issues of gender and race. And part of the reason I believe for this is he's coming out of the Marxist socialist tradition that it's all about the economy and class. And so gender and race are seen to be what they call epiphenomenal. So both race theory and gender theory comes out of the idea that this is not the case, that these are very important categories in and of themselves. So we see with Mary Wollstonecraft right from the beginning here, she's having to take this on, that the men in this movement that she's involved with often don't see it as relating to women. So she writes, but to render her really useful, she must not, if she discharge her civil duties, want individually the protection of civil laws. So what she's saying here is that women have to be protected by civil law, just the way that men are. And many of you will know that during this time period in England, women had very few rights, particularly married women had almost no control over their money. They didn't have the ability to own property. They didn't have the right to be educated at university or to be part of a profession. And so they're not protected by the law. They're considered sort of chattel as part of the man that they marry. And so she's making this larger legal argument that women need to be seen as full citizens. So that becomes a central plank, obviously, of all the feminist movements that follow. She must not be dependent on her husband's bounty for her subsistence during her life or support after his death. For how can a being be generous who has nothing of its own, or virtuous who is not free? Okay, so this is the idea of dependency and what that does to people, and how it distorts the relationship between husband and wife. And so this idea that women should have the ability to make their own money, this would have also been, it still is in certain, I've talked about the tradwife phenomenon, it's still controversial in certain circles, the idea of women being independent. And so she makes this a very important part of her larger program. And she, as I said, lived it herself as in her work as a governess. There were very few opportunities for women to make money on their own and to have control of it. Now, this language of how can somebody be generous, how can they act as a full citizen if they aren't free? So that language of freedom runs throughout, as we're going to look at as some of these different thinkers. As we've seen already, Wollstonecraft was extremely interested in the role of education and what the role that could play in the emancipation of women. But she wasn't just interested in education for women, but also for men, because at this time, also working class men weren't getting full education. So she writes, were boys and girls permitted to pursue the same studies together, those graceful decencies might early be inculcated, which produce modesty without those sexual distinctions that taint the mind. So again, I'm always struck when I reread her work that this is very radical on every level that she's talking about. So she's basically saying that boys and girls should be educated together. Again, many educational institutions were separated male from female up until very recently, and there's still some are. So she felt that when they were separated, it kind of exacerbated the weaknesses in both, so that by being together, they would be the best form of education. She was extremely critical of the types of education that upper class women typically got, which would be things like a smattering of French, some sewing, playing the piano, these kind of, they were seen as basically adornments that you would have to help you to get married. Again, if you look at some of Austen, the idea that you play your party piece in front of the men and it'll make you more marriageable. So she's basically saying we need to have a proper public educational system, both for men and women. Throughout the book, Wollstonecraft is responding to male authors' reasoning, people like Rousseau, but others as well, who have made various arguments for why women shouldn't be educated, why they don't need civil rights. So there's a variety of arguments that are made and are continued to be made. Some of them may have religious backing. Some of them, certainly if they're coming out of the Enlightenment, it's not a religious backing. It's sort of, they'll talk about the laws of nature, that by the laws of nature, women just aren't meant to hold public office, for instance. So there's many, many different arguments that are made, but she talks about the idea of femininity and cultural construction of femininity. She doesn't necessarily use that language. We're going to see many of the other thinkers also talk about this, that the arguments were that women are too obsessed with their personal lives or obsessed with their personal appearance. They're just not fit for instance, being in politics. And this was, when we talk about the vote for women, this argument was made for why women shouldn't have the vote. They're just too crazy and they might, do something crazy. And so she says, from the tyranny of man, I firmly believe the greater number of female follies proceed. And the cunning which I allow at present makes a part of their character, I likewise have repeatedly endeavored to prove is produced by oppression. Okay, so she's making this very important argument that what we read as feminine essence and nature is developed as a coping survival strategy. Even if we just talk the giggling, and so on. Like, I don't know if any of you have read or seen Gone with the Wind. The way Scarlett O'Hara is behaving, that would be seen as very feminine behavior, coquettish behavior. So she's saying these kind of follies are not intrinsic to women. And so we're getting right back again at this idea of, if we look at the sociobiologists, they would say, women have this certain biological essence, and that's what it is. So Wollstonecraft is saying this is a product of environment, it's a product of training. We all adapt within the situations in which we're born. We have to survive. And I was giving that example of Mrs. Austen, that she, in order for her to ensure that her daughters are going to be okay and not be in poverty, she's going to do this, whatever she thinks about it. And so I would say, there are more recent books about this. One's called The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf, that despite, obviously women have made incredible gains in places like Canada, but I don't think this pressure to be a certain kind of feminine has gone away at all. And in some ways, if I go by social media, I think the pressure is maybe even worse than it's ever been. I'll be interested to know your thoughts on that. But certainly from Wollstonecraft's point of view, this is not intrinsic to women. It's a production of, it's a result of their environment. Moving us into the 19th century moves us into what is often referred to as the first wave of feminism. And it's often left out that that first wave of feminism emerges almost completely out of the abolitionist movement. Not completely, but certainly the abolition movements in England, the United States, and Canada. And so there were stories of these women, often very religious women, working against slavery and realizing that they themselves did not have freedom. So this leads them to ask questions about their own state within society. And so abolition and women's rights are often very tightly tied together. So I want to look at Sojourner Truth. She was born into slavery in 1797. She's known as one of the most important human rights abolitionists and women's rights activists in history. And so she was born, as I said, into slavery as Isabella Baumfrey into a Dutch estate in New York, Dutch American. And she eventually changed her name and renamed herself Sojourner Truth, so it means traveler. And she became a Christian preacher. So she was preaching the gospel. And so we're told that, like most slaves, she endured incredible abuse, physical, sexual abuse, and that eventually she fled from the family that were enslaving her. And she is quoted as saying, "I did not run away, I walked away by daylight," which I think tells you a lot about her character. So she became involved with the movement to end slavery, but she also became involved with women's rights. So as I said, they're very tightly tied together from this point onward. This is an excerpt from a speech that Sojourner Truth gave at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio in 1852. And this is one of the most famous speeches in history in the English language. I learned it, I think, in middle school. I don't know if that's still the case, but it's considered to be, like with Winston Churchill and Martin Luther King, these very, very famous public speeches. So she says, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages and over mud puddles or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman?" So she's saying that that argument that's often made that, women don't need to be equal. They need men to take care of them, which is chivalry, which is how it should be. They're delicate, they can't get their hands too dirty. They can't do anything too physical. Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns. I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? So you can see this is a very moving speech about her own personal struggles. And she's also being satirical here, right? She's saying, if women are so delicate, why are you okay with letting enslaved women do this heavy, heavy labor that the men don't even have to do? So this is pointing out, and this runs throughout, we're going to see this later, the idea that when those arguments are being made about women, they're talking about upper class women. So when Rousseau is talking about the ideal woman, he's talking about upper class women. Lower class women of any background have always had to work, either as on farms or as servants, or no one worries about the servant having to get down on their knees and scrub the floor. But if it's an upper class woman, then she's too delicate. She's too delicate. So this speech is saying many, many things here about her society at that time. I want to move on to looking at the Canadian case, and one of the most important, if not the most important, pioneers of women's rights in Canada is Emily Stowe, and I'm willing to wager none of you have heard of her. And this is part of the problem. We don't learn Canadian history. We certainly don't learn women's history in Canada, but we don't learn our history at all a lot of times. So if you've heard of her, please let me know, because that would make me feel better about everything. So I came across her myself because I was not taught about her in history class when I was doing my own research. And she was the daughter of American Quakers who had moved up into Canada, into that kind of, some of you may know that area around Newmarket, Aurora was a Quaker area. And her family, when we look into it, because as you know, I study religion, so the Quakers were very radical when it came to gender, and they were among some of the earliest Christians to call for the full education of women and to talk about the equality of men and women in a certain way. And so the fact that she came from a family like that makes sense, because she didn't see the reason for these barriers. So I came across her because I was studying the Toronto Theosophical Society. So she was also interested in new religious movements. That's a story for another day. But she became the first Canadian woman to practice medicine in 1867. And she went on to become one of the most important people who was fighting for suffrage, or for the vote for women. And her daughter also became part of that, became a very important suffragist. So Dr. Stowe also worked to secure factory and health laws and a better Married Women's Property Act. So she was looking at the whole, very much the way Wollstonecraft was talking about, the whole picture of the legal rights of women. And she was also calling for the women to be allowed into the professions and into university. And so her daughter went on to be one of the first women to go into medical school at University in Toronto, and had a very hard time of it, but eventually was successful. So Emily Stowe is like these women that I've been showing you, one of these pioneering women who opened the doors for other women who came after her. So I wanted to look now at the Persons case, which is considered a watershed in terms of the rights of women in Canada. And this is an image of the statue that's on Parliament Hill. It was created by Barbara Patterson and put there in 2000. I've actually visited it. And so the Persons case, I think most of you will have learned this in school. I certainly hope so. So, Edward versus AG of Canada was a constitutional ruling that established the right of women to be appointed to the Senate. The case was initiated by the famous five. So, these statues are of the five women, a group of prominent women activists. In 1928, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that women were not persons, according to the British North American Act, now called the Constitution Act 1867. Therefore, they were ineligible for appointment to the Senate. I love that. They're not persons. So we're not people. That's just being really honest about it, I have to say. So these women went, I believe they had to go to England to fight it. So the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council reversed the court's decision in 1929. The Persons case enabled women to work within the House of Commons and the Senate. It also meant that women could no longer be denied rights based on a narrow interpretation of the law. So as I said, now we have within the current Canadian Constitution a guarantee of equal rights for women. So we need to be careful here. Again, this was only for certain women, and it would vary by province. And so Manitoba was actually the first province to give women the right to vote. And as it's pointed out in this entry, First Nations women didn't get the right to vote till 1960. And there are a number of the women involved here who have, there's other aspects of their history that aren't as savory. So this is true of women just as it is of men, but nonetheless, this case becomes very important and leads to others. And so, and I think we also have to be careful. Again, there's this tendency I find to say, oh, this is all in the past. And if we look at, I always ask my classes, do you know what percentage of people in Parliament are female? And it's, as of 2025, it's 30%, which apparently puts us 71 out of 182 countries in the world. So we're, for instance, way behind the UK. We're way behind Mexico. Mexico apparently is 50%. And so clearly, even though it's not illegal, there are other structural issues that are often preventing women from being involved in politics at that level. So the work continues. So I think it's really important to push back against that idea that this is something that's just in the past. The suffrage movement becomes another watershed point in the larger feminist movement as a whole. I'm going to focus on Canada, but this is true in many different countries. And so we've already looked a little bit at how this rolled out with the Persons case, but was the idea of in the Persons case it was being able to serve in Parliament. In this case, it's just being able to vote. So having the full rights of citizenship. So the British North America Act of 1867 specified that only male British subject age 21 years or upwards being householders shall have a vote. So this is a very complex history. In England, up until the late 1800s, only men with a certain amount of property and money were allowed to vote. So this is a very complex topic. And again, we're seeing that coming together of class and gender issues. So in the Canadian case, being part of the British Empire, this would have applied. And so it says in the Canadian Encyclopedia, the necessity of being male to vote reflected the emerging Victorian idea of placing women and men in separate spheres. Women were idolized as guarantors of cultural survival who had no place in political life. So this was that idea, some of you will have heard of this, the idea of the Victorian angel in the home. So men are out there fighting it out in the streets, in that dirty, challenging world, and women keep the home fires burning. And so the argument would be they don't need to vote. Their husbands will vote on their behalf. They'll vote for the whole family. So again, that idea of the woman sort of incorporated within the man, and that he's the one in functioning in public life. And this is still, as I said, this is still alive and well in certain places and in certain communities. That idea that women, you can see the discomfort with it, and you can see it with women politicians, the way the people make fun of them, for instance, for the way they dress, the way they speak. There's a kind of a scrutiny around their looks, for instance, that it wouldn't even occur to somebody to do that to a male politician. So some of this is obviously still in play, but the suffrage movement, it takes many, many years, but it's of course successful. And the right to vote in Canada is achieved, as I said, in a kind of piecemeal fashion by province, and also depending on ethnicity. So, as I said earlier, women from Indigenous communities didn't get the right to vote, along with the men, until 1960. I want to turn now to Simone de Beauvoir, the French feminist born in Paris in 1908. And she's a writer, a feminist, and a philosopher. And I got into a very strange argument with somebody years ago where he said she's not a philosopher. And I said, well, then what is she? And he couldn't tell me, but he said she's not a philosopher. But according to my sources, she's a philosopher. So she was closely associated with the existentialist movement. And she was personally in a relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre, and she and Sartre were like they still remain for many people the kind of the image of the intellectual, the public intellectual sitting out at cafes smoking. And so she wrote a number of important philosophical works, again emerging out of that existentialist tradition. She also wrote about aging, but her most famous work is The Second Sex, which took a while to come into English, but it's considered to be a classic of feminist literature and canonical within feminism. This quotation is taken from The Second Sex, and even the title of the book, The Second Sex, of course, is referring to Eve. So that idea that the way that both Judaism and Christianity often understood Eve was as a kind of helpmate for Adam. So we know that in some versions of the story, she was made from his rib. So she's sort of secondary. So she's not on a par with him. So the title of the book is pointing to that kind of background within Western culture. So you can see echoes here. I don't know if she read Wollstonecraft, but just these echoes as we go through feminist theory. One is not born, but rather becomes woman. No biological, psychic, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates this intermediary product between the male and the eunuch that is called feminine. So again, that idea of femininity as being created by culture, by the civilization you're living in. It doesn't come from an innate feminine psychology. It doesn't come from an innate feminine biology. It comes from the culture that creates it around the person. Now, one of the really important contributions that de Beauvoir makes is that she talks about how within the writing of men, women are often construed as what she calls the other. So she capitalizes the O, the other. So the woman becomes a kind of screen on which the man projects all these qualities. And often this is qualities that are opposite to him. So he's strong, she's weak. He's rational, she's emotional. These kind of ideas. And this has been a very important idea that gets taken up within colonial studies by thinkers like Edward Said, and he applies that in terms of race, the way that race becomes a projection by the colonial powers, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But so she's basically saying that this image of women has been created by male writers that have rendered these very particular forms of femininity. But she's arguing, of course, that women should have the right to develop as is natural to them and live up to their fullest potential. We're going to turn now to looking at the work of Betty Friedan and her most famous book, The Feminine Mystique. And so she was born in 1921 as Betty Goldstein to a Jewish family in Illinois. She did a degree in psychology at Smith College and then a year of graduate work at the University of California, Berkeley before settling in New York City. where she got married and lived for 10 years as a housewife and mother in the suburbs of New York while doing freelance work for a number of magazines. So in 1957, she sent out a questionnaire to her Smith classmates to ask them how they felt about their lives. And so what she got back illuminates the book that she writes, which is, she refers to the malaise that has no name, this feeling of that things aren't right, that they're unhappy and restless in their lives. And so the title, The Feminine Mystique, is the idea that this mystique has been created about what is feminine. And we've already seen this with a number of the thinkers we're looking at in this section, the way culture creates the idea of what it is to be feminine. And so she's arguing that this is a kind of ideology that says women should just be happy, working at home, for instance. And so even though these women got very good educations, they should just be happy to be, cleaning the floor. So this leads her to write the book. It was a huge bestseller and very controversial, again, going up against that. She was also very critical of advertising and the way that advertisers created these images of the perfect happy housewife. So as we see with Friedan, this is true of many, many feminists. She's an activist as well. She ends up divorcing in 1969. And in 1966, she co-founded the National Organization for Women, a civil rights group dedicated to achieving equality of opportunity for women. So one part of this was trying to get that Equal Rights Amendment passed into the American Constitution, which did not, they were not successful in that. But also she pushed for greater representation of women in government and for child care centers for working mothers and for legalized abortion and other reforms. So as I was going through this, I thought this is probably related to my own discomfort with some of the postmodern theory, because feminist theory, you also always have to have praxis. You can't just have theory. There has to be some practice involved in it. And so we already see with many of these women, they were politically active around civil rights. I want to turn now to the work of Bell Hooks, whose work is central and canonical to feminism. She was born in 1952 in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and actually returned to Kentucky and died there in 2021 after a life as a writer and a scholar. And she's known for examining the connections between race, gender, and class, particularly from the perspective of Black women. So she was born Gloria Watkins and grew up in the segregated South, the American South. At age 19, this is very incredible. At age 19, she began writing what would become her first full-length book, Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism. So you can see she's harking back to Sojourner Truth there, which was published in 1981. She studied English literature at Stanford, did an MA at the University of Wisconsin, and then a PhD at the University of California. So she was an academic as well. So she took a pseudonym, Bell Hooks, which was her great-grandmother's, the name of her great-grandmother, and she wanted to honor the female legacy within her own family, and she preferred to spell it in lowercase letters. I couldn't do it. This program would not let me put it in lowercase letters. But the idea of being humble and that it was about her work and not about her as a person. And so I was reading an interview with her, and I was pretty surprised to note, I shouldn't have been, but I was, that she was also a very religious person. And so she said in the interview that she viewed all of her work as service, so that idea of Christian service. So she combines these elements of left-wing thought, but also religious belief. So in her book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, Hooks looks at the idea of what we would now call intersectionality, and is very critical of early, some of the second wave feminists like Betty Friedan, and the fact that she believes that they're looking at the experience of very elite white women. So she writes, privileged feminists have largely been unable to speak to, with, or for diverse groups of women because they either do not understand fully the interrelatedness of sex, race, and class oppression, or refuse to take this interrelatedness seriously. So this is an ongoing tension within the feminist movement, this idea of who is it speaking for? Is it speaking for all women? Can you use that category in that way? and this is it's an ongoing discussion. And so Hooks was one of the, probably the most important voice for inclusion of all groups of women and acknowledgement that their experience is different than it would be for people like Betty Friedan. So feminist analysis of women's lot tend to focus exclusively on gender and do not provide a solid foundation on which to construct feminist theory. So she's basically saying you can't build up feminist theory if you're just looking at gender. You have to include things like race and class. So, for instance, if we just look at class in terms of regardless of ethnicity, working class people, as we've said, have always had to work. The women have always had to work. So the perception of what is feminine will differ also by class and by often by race. I want to end this section with the Me Too movement and an image from the Me Too movement, and I wanted to come back to this idea that feminism is a cultural political movement, and that's why I'm including a picture from a street protest, because when we look at suffrage, when we look at all these issues, a lot of it was decided in the street through protest. It wasn't just sitting in a room and thinking thoughts and lobbying politicians and so on. And so Me Too begins in 2006 with the work of Tarana Burke, who I went on her website, and this is what she says about herself. I'll include this on Blackboard. For nearly 3 decades, activist and advocate Tarana J. Burke has worked at the intersection of racial justice, arts and culture, anti-violence, and gender equity, fueled by commitments to interrupt sexual violence and other systemic inequalities disproportionately impacting marginalized people, particularly Black women and girls. And so she's just written a book, which I didn't know, so I'm gonna have to get that. It's called Unbound. So it's her autobiography, My Story of Liberation and the Birth of the Me Too Movement. So it's coming out of her own experience. And so no one knows exactly why, but in 2017, this broke widely and internationally. And some of it may have to do, to give credit where it's due, to the internet. I've been very critical of the internet in this course, but certainly in this case, it allowed people from all over the world, from any background, to put out a hashtag. And so people started doing this, of saying Me Too, that they too had experienced sexual violence, intimate partner violence, sexual harassment at work. So trying to take the stigma and the shame away from the woman. And this just went, many of you will remember it, it went widespread. And so in the beginning in 2017, there were many quite famous actresses who came forward. And I later watched documentaries and was absolutely shocked that within the film and television industry, the rampant sexual violence and harassment that was going on. And I felt really guilty about this, because I think there is just kind of an attitude, or there was, that actresses is called the casting couch, and it's just sort of part of it, and not looking at it as what it is, which is harassment. And a number of actresses that were very popular, say 20 years ago, would suddenly disappear. And I remember this. It's like, where did that actress go? And it turns out that powerful film producers had sort of blackballed them and stopped them from getting roles. And so they would spread rumors about them that they were difficult and things like this. And what we find out later, there's Harvey Weinstein is the most famous one, but there are many, would systematically sexually harass these actors. And many of them left the profession as a result. And so that was startling. And I was also caught off guard, because in my vast naivete, I thought that a lot of this had been dealt with and in the workplace, and it has not. And so a lot of people fell from their pedestal during this time, in Canada as well. Probably the most notorious case was Jean Gomeshi, who was total golden boy at CBC. He had a really popular program. It was popular all over North America. and he was charged with sexual violence. And as is often the case with this, he got off all of his charges. It's very, very hard to prove these things in a court of law, and it's very hard on the people that bring the charges. However, the court of public opinion decided that he is persona non grata, and so he's basically unable to work in Canada now. So it was very interesting to see the way the community in Canada decided his fate, regardless of what the courts were saying. And I think really, on a certain level, that's even more important, that there's a cultural change in that way. And we also saw, as a result of this, I'll just use Hollywood as an example. Many women of various backgrounds starting their own production companies and making their own movies and television, so to make sure that their stories are going out there and that these gatekeepers can't stop it anymore. So the Me Too movement is obviously ongoing, but I think it's an important marker of where the movement stands today, that the issues, they shift and change slightly, and they're dealt with differently. Obviously, as I was talking about, we're living in a time of social media, so a lot of it is taking place online now. But nonetheless, the basic tools remain, which, as I said, is street protest, becoming involved politically. So that's also been a huge part of it, of trying to support women to run for political office. This is a very important part of this larger movement.